Thank you for joining us on this webinar for Introduction to Provisional Certification. This is a subject that's really dear to my heart, mentoring and supporting teachers particularly at the beginning of their career, but also throughout the career. So this webinar will focus on provisional certification and the induction and mentoring program that provisionally certificated teachers will be undertaking, but it will also cover information for those of you who are mentors, and for those of you who are what used to be called subject to confirmation, now called PUMAL certificates, moving back to full. So there'll be something for all of you here. But I'd like to start off with congratulating those of you who are new graduates and recently gained your provisional certificates for the first time. It's awesome that you've joined us in this really rewarding profession. Lifelong learning ahead of you as you grow even more each year in your expertise and your ability to teach really effectively. So big congratulations and welcome to the profession. Some of you might be provisional teachers who are partway through your provisional period and have come to this webinar to check that you're on the right track with things, or to fine tune, or to get ideas about how you might further improve your time in your provisional period. And as I said, some of you will be mentors or subject to confirmation teachers wanting to return to full certification. So feel free to share in the chat if you would like to, where in your career journey you are and perhaps what brought you to this video. And we'll be collecting any questions that you have in the chat. So please feel free to add any questions, and Angela will interject those into the presentation as we go through at appropriate times, and we'll have a time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. So feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat as we go along. Given that we've only got an hour or so together, we'll be taking quite a broad overview of provisional certification. There's so much in this area and we don't have time to cover it all. So we'll be sort of addressing edited highlights, if you like, the key things that it's important for you to know. We've got a further 3-part online program for provisional certificated teachers starting in April that will go into more depth about many of the things that we'll be talking about this evening. And we also have a program for mentors that will be very successfully run last year, but we have revamped it with new material, and that'll be being released in March. So keep your eyes open for those things if you are interested in going a little bit deeper after you've had this introduction today. So being a provisionally certificated teacher is a really important part in an ongoing learning trajectory for you as a professional. It begins, of course, when you enter your initial teacher education program, and it doesn't finish until you stop teaching. So hopefully that's many, many years' time. The expectation is that every year you'll refine your practice and become more effective at affecting outcomes for learners than you were in the year before. So it's an ongoing process. This is your provisional period is not, when you become fully certificated, that's it, you're done. Ongoing learning practice is always changing. New theories, new research comes out to inform our practice, and we're constantly learning and adapting as we go. So be ready for that roller coaster of ongoing professional learning. When you graduated, you probably would have applied pretty much straight away for your registration from the Teaching Council. And when you receive your registration, that's for life, unless you do something that would mean that your practicing, your registration was revoked. So that's something like of a serious criminal nature, serious breaches of the Code of Professional Responsibility, incompetent practice, things like that would result in you having your registration revoked and not being able to teach in the future. But for the most part, people remain registered, and the practicing certificate is the status that changes. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. As you would have received your first provisional practicing certificate, and like all practicing certificates, that is valid for a period of 3 years, needs to be renewed every 3 years. And as a provisional teacher, you are required to take part in an induction and mentoring program in order to move to full certification. So I'll talk more about what that program, induction and mentoring program, needs to involve a little bit later in the webinar. Once you meet the requirements to move to full certification, you hold a Tūturu or full practicing certificate category 1. And to maintain that status, you also have to meet certain requirements. So once again, I'll talk more about that a little later. If you are unable to meet those requirements, perhaps you leave teaching for a while to have a family, or you decide to leave teaching temporarily and then want to return. It may be that you haven't had sufficient teaching experience recently to have a full certificate on your return, in which case you would go to a PUMO or full practicing certificate category 2. Used to be called subject to confirmation. But let's have a look a bit more closely at these 3 categories of certification. So as I said, a provisional certificate is a tōmua, and it will be renewed like all of the other practicing certificates every 3 years. When you get your first practicing certificate, you have a maximum of 5 years, or perhaps 6 if the Teaching Council gives you a discretionary extra year, to move to full certification. If you can't move to full by then you will need to do a teacher education refresh course, which is 6 months, and last time I looked, around $3,000. But so that's something that you really want to avoid if possible. And so it has implications, of course, for whether you have a family. If you're going overseas, hopefully we'll be able to do that again in the not too distant future. Or if you want to take a break from teaching, I would really recommend that you complete your induction and mentoring program first, and then do those other life experience things, if at all possible. And the reason that I say that is that it's much easier to maintain a full practicing certificate, or to regain it if you've gone to PUMAL, subject to confirmation, than it is to gain it in the first place, because of the requirements for the time that you need to be involved in the program. So in order to be engaged in an induction and mentoring program and to move to full certification, there's a few things that you need to be aware of. Probably the most important one is that you need to be working in a teaching position at least 0.5 of an FTE. So what that means is, 5 days in a week is 1 full-time FTE. The equivalent, you need to be working the equivalent of 2.5 days in your centre, presuming it's a all-day license, and the days that the hours that centres open, of course, vary, but rule of thumb, you need to be working 2.5 of your centre's days to be meeting that 0.5 FTE requirement. As I said, the involvement in an induction and mentoring program is also critical. It's not okay just to do the 2 years. There needs to be a structured program of support. You need to have a mentor who's meeting with you and observing you, giving you feedback on your practice, supporting you in an active way, rather than just have somebody who's nominated as your mentor but treats you like any other member of the team. So there needs to be additional support in place in a formalized way, structured way, for it to be considered an induction and mentoring program. So the minimum of 2 years, often it takes a little bit longer than 2 years for a whole range of circumstances to meet the standards independently, which is the benchmark for being able to move to full. So 2 years and being able to demonstrate the 6 standards for the teaching profession independently. Sometimes it takes a little longer than that. Perhaps you're finding a particular standard a little bit tricky. Perhaps it's that other life things get in the way of you giving full focus for a period of time, and so you need a little bit longer. That's all fine as long as you're completing your shift to full certification within that 5 or 6 years. There's no shame at all in taking longer than the 2 years for your induction and mentoring program, and no negative consequences to that. So just be aware that 2 years is the minimum. For fully certificated teachers, those holding tūturu practicing certificates, they also need to demonstrate that they meet the standards of the teaching profession on an ongoing basis. So every year there's a process of appraisal and professional growth cycle, whereby teachers' practice is judged, I guess, against the standards for the teaching profession. And then every 3 years at the renewal of their practicing certificate, their professional leader endorses that they have met the standards over that time. Those holding a PUMAL certificate, what used to be called subject to confirmation, sometimes there's a confusion, and they are seen as very similar to those people who are provisionally certificated. That's not the case. Those of you who hold PUMAL certificates have already demonstrated that you can meet the standards independently. It's a matter that you haven't been teaching for a while, and so perhaps your professional knowledge and expertise is not quite current, or you're not in a position whereby you can meet all the standards. Perhaps you're relieving, for example, day relieving, which doesn't give you the ongoing connection with a single group of learners so that you're able to be fully involved in the assessment and the planning and the other parts of centre life. So if you're a PUMAL teacher, the requirements to move back to full is you would need to be in a teaching position that allowed you to be fully involved in centre life, and that's usually judged to be around the 2 days a week mark. So you're responsible for assessment and for planning, attending team meetings, professional development, things like that, fully involved in all aspects of centre life. And then the other requirement is that you have 1 year mentored teaching. So that's not as intense as it is for a provisionally certificated teacher, and generally speaking, the processes that centres have in place for professional growth cycles and appraisals are sufficient to cover that mentoring requirement for PUMAL moving back to tūturu. So if you have somebody as part of your professional growth cycle having conversations with you about your practice, observing you, giving you feedback, so there's some, you're not just teaching on your own and doing the best that you can, there's some support for your development as a teacher from your professional leader or perhaps a designated mentor, then that is sufficient for that transition back to a full practicing certificate. The idea is to regain the currency, the up-to-dateness, if that's a word, of your professional knowledge. So very similar processes for the 3 categories of certification. It's just really a difference in the level of support. So much more support for provisional teachers, some support for PUMAL teachers, and minimal support, still engaged with professional discussions and feedback and such like, but much more independent expectations if you're fully certificated. Also, the intensity is different for provisionally certificated teachers. So you would be meeting more frequently and in a more focused sort of a way. So some of the key requirements I'm going to cover off here, and these apply to all categories of certification. There's so much confusion about requirements for certification, renewal of practicing certificates, and induction and mentoring for provisional teachers in particular. So you may be part of Facebook groups and such like that ask questions about how many hours do you need to do and what needs to be involved in the process. What I would say is the best place to go for reliable information is directly to the Teaching Council. And the Teaching Council has what's called a registration and certification policy, and it spells out all of the requirements for gaining a provisional certificate, from moving from provisional to full, for maintaining full, for moving to PUMAL, from moving from PUMAL back to, it's got all of that information in there. And I've been, this presentation is largely drawn from there, as well as obviously my experience and knowledge. But so that's the link there is, it takes you directly to the policy, and your questions will be covered off in there, I'm sure. And if you have anything that's sort of a little bit particular to your particular context or circumstances, you know, maybe you're considering going overseas and teaching and you're wanting to know if that experience would count to being your provisional induction and mentoring program, then email the council directly. Don't rely on what other people tell you, because much of it will be right, but not all of it, and it can really put the spanner in the works if you get the wrong information. So in terms of provisional teachers in particular, well, actually, I'll back up the chart. For all categories of certification, to renew a practicing certificate, these things in the bullet points are requirements. So you need to be New Zealand registered teachers. So if you have a practicing certificate, you will be registered, and you need to remain registered. So the only way that you can lose your registration once you've gained it is if you do something really bad and you're struck off the register through, you know, for inappropriate behaviour or poor practice. You need to sign at the time of renewal. The form requires you to sign that you are committed to the Code of Professional Responsibility, that you have a satisfactory police vet in New Zealand, and if you've been overseas, from overseas jurisdictions as well, that you continue to meet the fit to be a teacher criteria. So, for example, if you have struggles with mental health, there may be times where actually that's not able to be controlled in a way that would mean that you would be fit to be a teacher. Most of the time, of course, it can be. Or if you had an accident or some other physical circumstances which meant that you couldn't move quickly to support children if there was an emergency, or you weren't able to supervise them sufficiently, then you would no longer be fit to be a teacher. The final point there is that you, on renewal, sign a declaration to say that you're committed to develop and practice te reo mena tikanga Māori. So this is a relatively new requirement. It's not sufficient just to have a basic understanding. You need to continue to develop, and in actual fact that's inherent in the standards for the teaching profession. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So those expectations are for all teachers renewing practicing certificates. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that not all provisional teachers receive the high quality support that they're entitled to. So this little document here, the Induction and Mentoring Guidelines put out by the Teaching Council, available on their website. I'd recommend that all of you, whether you are provisional teachers or mentors, have a look at that. It sort of steps out the expectations for an induction and mentoring program for provisional teachers, and I'll draw on it a little bit shortly, and we'll go through some of the key things, but just know that it is there and it's well worth having a look at and becoming familiar with. It's also important that you know that in the licensing criteria, part of the licensing criteria is that centres are expected to support teachers to move to full certification. It's unfortunate, though, that the criteria don't specify what that support needs to look like. And so it is quite variable. Research has shown that it is quite variable across the sector. But if you know that it's a requirement for licensing, and that there are guidelines that the Teaching Council is expecting centres to work within, then that can really help you to advocate for yourself or for mentors to advocate for good support and conditions for their provisional teachers. So let's look a little bit more in detail about what programs of support might involve. Firstly, I'd like to have a look at the purpose of an induction and mentoring program. So in your initial teacher education program, you would have gained considerable theoretical knowledge and some opportunities through practicum to put that knowledge into practice. So now you're moving to being a qualified teacher. That brings different responsibilities. Even if you've been a field-based student and working while you're studying, being a fully qualified teacher brings different responsibilities and expectations of you. And international research shows that making that transition into teaching while you're still learning to teach is really challenging. And that's why the council, the Teaching Council, has in place this expectation for induction and mentoring. We're actually really privileged in New Zealand that we have such strong expectations for support of beginning teachers. A lot of countries don't have that. We're less fortunate in ECE than in the compulsory sector, in that we don't get the funding, the centralised funding that schools do to support provisional teachers and their mentors. But, you know, we've got the guidelines are pretty up there in terms of high quality expectations. And if centres were working in ways that were aligned with the guidelines, we'd have, you know, world-class induction and mentoring programs. So the purpose of induction and mentoring is twofold. This is the vision statement from the induction and mentoring guidelines, and you can see these two parts here. The expectation is that you will become, through your provisional period, and by the time you apply for a full practicing certificate, you will become an effective teacher for all learners, and that you are engaged in the profession really actively and in your ongoing learning. So it's about building your capability from wherever it is now to the point where you are effective for all learners, and you have developed, strengthened the professional habits that will allow you to be a really contributing member of your team and of the profession more broadly, constantly seeking to improve your practice. So your mentor's role, along with that of your team, but specifically your mentor, is to help you and to actively contribute to that development. Similarly, for fully certificated teachers, the professional growth cycle process is so that you will become more effective teachers and more professionally engaged and committed. So, it's like I said at the beginning, it's just an ongoing trajectory of professional learning and the expertise and capability that brings. So in terms of the process, the guidelines identify three big ideas that your induction and mentoring program should address, but it's up to each individual service to design their own induction and mentoring. Often it's your centre manager or your head teacher that might be designated as your mentor, but those people can often really be very busy and quite stretched with lots of other priorities. If they're able to give the time and attention to your mentoring, that's great. If they're not, then it would be worthwhile seeing if you could have somebody from perhaps your teaching team or another teaching team in your service, rather than somebody who doesn't have the time or perhaps even sometimes the interest to support your practice. So you could advocate for an alternative if necessary. So the process is expected to be comprehensive, which means that you'll be involved in ongoing professional learning. That might be attending courses or having facilitators come into your centre, but it also means observing the teachers that you're working with and learning from them, or experimenting in your practice and learning from that process, and of course reading and attending webinars like this and the many others that ECE Learning Unlimited provide. So ongoing professional learning, participation in professional networks, both within your centre and beyond your centre. So the Teaching Council really likes to see teachers being supported to make relationships with people from a range of different services, maybe online or maybe face-to-face. High quality mentoring. Once again, there's very little mentor training available in New Zealand. And apart from postgraduate papers at universities, training providers, as far as I know, the mentor development program that I provide is the only formalised ECE specific mentor training. It needs to be standards based. So obviously we've got the standards for the teaching profession that is fundamental to the induction and mentoring process, and it needs to be evidence informed. So what that means is that whatever is happening within your induction and mentoring program isn't just somebody's random bright idea, but it comes from a well-informed place, informed by research, formal research, or informed by evidence of how things are going in the program in your service. The next of the big ideas that are in the induction and mentoring guidelines, defining how an induction and mentoring program should be. It should be educative. So this is a time where you're learning new skills and practicing things. You know, you're a beginning teacher. We're all becoming, even me, I started teaching in the early 1980s, and I'm still becoming a more effective teacher. Your whole career as a teacher should be becoming a teacher. We never quite get there. So learning and practicing new skills and the attitudes and attributes of being an effective teacher and a committed professional. And it should be aligned with the professional growth cycle of your service. So what I advocate is that the induction and mentoring program is distinct, something special for the provisionally certificated teachers, but it flows on to whatever your fully certificated teachers in your service are doing for their professional growth cycle. So it's not like two completely different things. One leads to the other. And in the educative paradigm, it's the positioning of the mentor in relation to the provisional teacher is really important. So in traditional views of mentoring, you've got a mentor who's, highly experienced, relatively expert, and you've got a provisional teacher who's a novice. And it's like the expert is teaching the novice how to teach. That's not an educative approach. The way that educative mentoring, and there's been lots of research internationally done about the benefits of this approach to mentoring. Educative mentoring is each person brings their own set of skills and knowledge, and together they contribute equitably, differently, but equitably, as together they explore teaching and learning. So they'll both be learning in the process, they'll both be teaching in the process. It's like the idea of ARCOR. So that's an educative approach, and ideally your induction and mentoring program would be like that. And the third of the big ideas is evaluative. So you should be receiving feedback on your practice and how you're going in relation to the standards. So at the time that you apply for full certification, you need to be able to meet all of the 6 standards of the teaching profession. At the time you start your provisional, you've just graduated, you've passed your initial teacher education program, so you would have passed the standards at that level. But that level for graduating teachers is with, a measure of support. Over your provisional period, you need to become increasingly independent in your being able to meet the standards by yourself without a lot of scaffolding and support. So obviously when you're at the beginning of that process, you'll receive more, or you will need and hopefully receive more support and scaffolding, but it's about coming to meet the standards rather than a binary, either you meet them or you don't. So that growing to meet the standards, and you need to know, what else do you need to do in order to meet the standards? Where are you on that trajectory of your learning? There needs to be some documentation of your of the progress and of your development. So this is an area where there's a lot of misinformation. In terms of expectations from the Teaching Council, they don't have a lot of expectations about how or what should be documented, but what they do say is there needs to be evidence of a program of support for you. And so you would be wise perhaps to have an agreement between PCT and mentor, who's going to be doing what in this process. Perhaps a schedule, a plan of how often you're going to meet, how many observations are going to happen, and meeting notes as you go through the process. For the provisional teacher, in terms of documenting their own work in this process, I recommend that you find a way of documenting that fits as closely as you can to what is expected of your fully certificated teachers in your centre. And my recommendation is that your documentation, rather than filling your folder full of stuff and gathering stuff that proves that you meet each of the standards, that you focus on 3 questions. So the 3 questions are these: what am I learning? What am I doing differently because of what I'm learning? And what difference is that making for the children? So if you do sort of little cycles of exploration focusing around those 3 questions, what am I learning? What am I doing differently? And what difference is that making? What are the outcomes for the children? Then that will show your progress and development. It'll also show the children's progress and development. Yeah, so more documentation is definitely not better. I would say that many mentors, in my research, my PhD research shows this, and others in New Zealand and overseas does as well. Mentors tend to mentor in the way that they were mentored. And so, up until relatively recently, provisional teachers were expected to gather big folders of evidence against each of the standards. And so if your mentor did that when they were being mentored, they may still think that that is the expectation. So once again, having a good look around the Teaching Council website, there's information about induction mentoring programs there. There's information about what documentation does need to be kept. As I said, it's about evidence of the program, documentation of meetings and feedback and observations, documentation of your reflective thinking, but that doesn't necessarily mean writing reflections. It can be just quite brief comments about, oh, when I talked to so-and-so, it really got me thinking about such and such, and I wonder why I hadn't thought about that before, and now I'm going to do something differently. So you don't need to use a Smythe model or a data model or Brookfield's lenses or those models that you learnt at initial teacher education programs. Those are to teach you to be reflective. Hopefully by now you are reflective, and your reflection, or I like to say reflecting rather than reflection. So reflecting is a process of thinking about your practice and refining and implementing refinements. Reflection tends to be an A4 piece of paper, full stop. And that's not particularly useful in improving practice, or not always useful in improving practice. So those are the big ideas of what an induction and mentoring program should include. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the standards for the teaching profession. These are fundamental. You'll already be familiar with them from your ITE programs. But as I said, the provisional period is about you becoming increasingly independent in being able to demonstrate those fully. So I like to think about the 6 standards for the teaching profession as our learning trajectories, as I sort of alluded to before. In Te Whāriki, the learning outcomes for children are prefaced with the statement, over time and with guidance and support, children become increasingly capable of, and then each of the 20 learning outcomes. If we use that same sentence starter, if you like, over time and with guidance and support, children become, PCTs become increasingly capable of meeting each of the standards. That's an improvement focus. It sees this process of becoming and, provisional, but also ongoing throughout your teaching career as consistently getting better. And in the full provisional program, I'll go into the standards more fully. But for now, here's a story to help you remember them, because the order of them is important. So you can see on the slide here that I've placed Tiriti o Waitangi as the foundation of the triangle, and we go further up to the pointy end of teaching. So the story goes like this. We teach in New Zealand, and everything in New Zealand is or should be founded on Tiriti o Waitangi. So that's why it's at the bottom. It's the foundation of all aspects of our practice, our relationships, everything. And as qualified teachers, certificated teachers, we bring to our work a body of professional learning that's unique to our profession. No other profession has the professional knowledge that we do in teaching. And then we bring that professional knowledge, and we need to work in teaching, we need to work with other people in professional relationships. If we're not in relationship with other people in our work, there can be no teaching. It's a fundamental part of our work, professional relationships. And those relationships are founded on treaty principles. And then bringing our professional knowledge to the picture and working with others in treaty-based ways, we create places that have learning at the focus, that have a learning-focused culture. So that's about your organisational conditions in your centre. And then in those places, we design for the learning of individuals and groups of children. So assessment and planning sits here. And then once we've assessed and planned, we implement the appropriate strategies for particular children at a particular time in particular circumstances. So that's the teaching. And that flow, that hierarchy, if you like, is really critical for you to think about. So when you're thinking about perhaps goals, you might have a goal that's around, as many beginning teachers do, around assessment, writing effective learning stories, for example. Now, you can't look at that in isolation. Writing more effective learning stories will enhance your planning and your teaching, but also in order to write effective learning stories, you need to be thinking about and working in your organisational culture, working with other teachers and with whānau and obviously with the children, bringing a whole lot of professional learning and treaty-based practice to the fore. So all of the standards are integrated and in relationship. None of them can sit separately. They're distinct, but not separate, if that makes sense. So something to think about, and I will, as I said, go more into it later in the provisionally certificating teachers program. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about your role as a teacher, a provisionally certificated teacher in your induction and mentoring program, or a PUMAL teacher in your mentoring program, or even a fully certificated teacher in your professional growth cycle. What's important is that it's your professional learning journey, no one else's. And although others in the centre and those who are supporting you, your professional leaders and your mentors, will be part of that journey and walking alongside you, you need to be the one that's driving it. And I often say to people, provisional teachers, when I start mentoring them, I'm not your mother and I'm not your policeman. You know, you need to develop the habits and the independence yourself. If something's not working for you, say something about it, do something about it. If you don't feel comfortable addressing it directly with the person you need to speak to, then find somebody who can stand alongside and support and advocate for you. One of the things that my research showed causes the most frustration and sometimes breakdown in mentoring relationships is a mismatch of expectations about who should be doing what and how that should happen. So I really advocate that you spend some time at the beginning of any mentoring program or any professional growth cycle and talk about the sort of support you might need, particularly for provisional teachers. What do you need to learn best? What do you need? Little and often feedback? Do you need big feedback? Do you like working with big conceptual complex ideas, or do you need some stepping stones to help you progress towards a goal? If you're able to share those sorts of things with your mentor, you're much more likely to get support in the way that works best for you. So have those conversations with them at the beginning. Hopefully they will raise those sorts of things with you, but if they don't, you know, try not to be backward in coming forward. Ask questions if you're not sure about something. Ask questions about how things work. If you meet your commitments and communicate professionally, you're bound to get your mentor meeting you in a positive way. Occasionally, perhaps not, and you can seek a different mentor, but generally speaking, we like to be in relationships that we find mutually beneficial. And so if your mentor feels like they're really contributing to their learning and you are on the walker and progressing forward, then they'll continue to support you. If you start lagging behind and not meeting your obligations and not following through on the things that you said that you'll do, it's possible that the mentor will find that not so rewarding and take a step back. So, you know, be proactive in the relationship. In terms of your personal documentation, as I said, keeping those 3 questions in mind: what am I learning? What am I doing differently? What difference is that making? It's useful to track that process in writing somehow. So whether lots of centres use Educa or StoryPark for their children's portfolios, so you might be able to access online portfolios for you as a teacher as well. Many centres do that. You might just want to keep a Word document with you know, almost like a rolling diary of those key things, those key questions. There's lots of free options like OneNote or Google Sites or different blog platforms doesn't matter whether you're digital or pen and paper. Some people like mind mapping or flow charts. Find a way that works for you and that meets your centre's way of doing things as well. See if you can find an approach that meets both of those, your needs and those of your centre. Feel free to discuss how you might document your learning journey with your mentor teacher. So to recap some key ideas, key points here. You need to meet the requirements as I specified and that are specified in the registration and certification policy in order to move to full practicing certificate and maintain it, or to move from PUMAL back to full. For provisional teachers, that means a minimum of 2 years in a 0.5 full-time equivalent position. For PUMAL moving back to full, it's a 1 year mentored teaching practice, amount of time per week unspecified, but 2 days a week is, in conversations that I've had with teaching council personnel, 2 days a week is their rule of thumb. An induction and mentoring program needs to be comprehensive, educative and evaluative. So if you are in a centre, if you find yourself 6 months down the track and you haven't had any input from a mentor, if you haven't had anybody observe your practice formally and give you feedback about that, you need to start asking questions about that, because if you leave it too long, you're going to be ending up doing much more than 2 years, because unless you're in an active program, that time doesn't count. So be proactive. It's your journey. Your mentor is your traveling partner along your learning journey, your supporter, your challenger, not your policeman, your babysitter, your mother. And the treaty of Waitangi should underpin all aspects of your practice. You constantly be thinking in your practice, what does the treaty mean for me in relation to this goal, or what would the treaty tell me that I would need to do in this circumstance? Really having that firm foundation of treaty-based practice, absolutely critical. So that's all from me. I will stop my share, and I'm sure there's some questions.
I have a question, Barbara. Does a mentor need to be a fully certificated teacher for a PCT?
Yes, they do. If they are not, they need to hold a full practicing certificate category 1, so they can't be subject to confirmation. And the reason for that is because if you're not meeting the standards yourself, how would you be able to make the professional judgment as to whether somebody else meets those standards? Yeah.
Right, gotcha. And are people able to have a mentor that doesn't work in their centre or their same room? Can they get an external mentor?
Yes, all of those. It's better to have, ideally, a mentor who's working alongside you, who is actively supporting you, and who is knowledgeable and skillful, is the best, because you've got that immediate opportunity to talk through practice, and they're seeing your everyday practice informally, working alongside, as well as through formal observations. That's not always possible, so it's better to have a good mentor externally or in a different room than a poor mentor in your room, or a mentor that's too busy to, So yes, it's certainly within a larger centre with multiple rooms, you can have somebody from a different room observe you and give you feedback and be your mentor. A little bit more difficult to organise in terms of scheduling, but absolutely possible. Sometimes if you're in a larger organisation with multiple centres, you might have a mentor who mentors a number of provisional teachers in different centres. And there are people who mentor externally as paid mentors. So if your centre is not able to support you by providing you a mentor within your organisation, it's possible to access external mentors who do that work for a cost. That cost ideally would be covered by your centre, because your centre is responsible for supporting you move towards full certification outlined in the licensing criteria. However, if they are not going to come to the party with that, certainly advocate for that position, show them in the licensing criteria that that's their responsibility if you can. Then rather than just say, oh, well, I'll do it for myself, see if you can come to a split arrangement, so at least they are contributing. It's not okay for services to expect you to pay for your own external mentor and do all of your induction and mentoring work outside of centre hours. That, they're not supporting you at all if they're doing that.
Are there any guidelines around the minimum hours or how many times mentors and PCTs should be getting together for formal conversations, discussions, observations?
No, is the short answer to that. There's no, each centre can define their own induction and mentoring program, but I have a personal view on that. I think, research clearly shows that the aspects of teaching that new teachers, beginning teachers, find most challenging are assessment and planning. And in ECE centres, it's common for planning or much of planning to be done collaboratively, at a team meeting. But assessment is often, okay, here's your group of children, or here's your number of learning stories that you have to do. Off you go in your non-contact time and do it. I really, particularly in the beginning phases of provisional certification, I would really advocate against that. I would advocate that mentors work directly with their PCTs, creating assessment documentation, at least for the first 6 months, and then gradually the PCT can become more independent. So that means that shared non-contact time if possible, or at least conversations, lots of conversations prior to non-contact time. My personal view on observations and meetings and things like that is it's very much individual. Some people need more than others. Particularly in the beginning stages, if you're not very confident as a PCT, you might need more frequent, check-ins. But generally speaking, I like to think of doing something scheduled once a month, at least once a month. So you might do an observation and a feedback session 1 month, and then the next month might be a professional conversation, sort of checking on progress and seeing how documentation is coming together, that sort of thing. I write off December and January because it's always crazy, but I find that sort of schedule keeps things ticking over, makes sure that the program stays on track and moving forward. But like I say, some people might need more, particularly in the beginning, getting things started, more frequent times than that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. There's a couple of questions here. And if anyone else has questions, please pop them in now, because we will be finishing shortly. So put them into the chat. In terms of physical evidence from PCTs, Barbara, would 1 page per standard suffice? That's the correct word.
Nice. Yep.
The experiences and practical knowledge skills, is that okay?
Okay. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And what I would say is that although we used to get evidence for each standard, what's more important now is that, as I said, these standards are so integrated. It's actually not particularly useful to document them separately. So what I prefer to do is to have conversations with the PCT to identify areas of practice that there would be focuses of improvement. So essentially setting a goal. So it might be around improving learning stories, for example, or creating learning stories that engage whānau, maybe. And I would document the learning, the differences in practice, the outcomes for children, those 3 questions. That's what I would be documenting. And then the conversations between the mentor and the PCT would be making links to the standards. You don't need to say this is evidence of this XYZ standard and this is evidence. But if I was to speak to a PCT, a second year PCT in particular, and say, well, okay, so where in your documentation, where in your journey is Te Reti o Waitangi standard evident? They should be able to answer that. They should be able to give me the articulate how thinking about that standard has informed what they do. So it's much more a tracking your learning journey and making connections back to the standards. Also, many centres now have a quality practice template. So if you don't know about a quality practice template, essentially it's the contextualised, your centre's contextualised version of what the standards look like in practice for you. And so meeting the standards would be a teacher, a PCT, doing all of those things that are on your quality practice template. So that's another reference point to be talking about practice. I really advocate not having folders for each, like a subdivided folders for each standard, or thinking about how much do I need to do for each standard.
Is there any audit process for this, Barbara? Are PCTs audited when they apply for full certification?
No, it's a high trust model, and the expectation is that mentors and professional leaders who endorse the application for full know what they're doing and know what the standards should be. Will have defined those standards in their service, typically through a quality practice template. And at this endorsement of the practicing certificate, the mentor is saying, this teacher meets all of these standards, they're fit to be a teacher, they're committed to Te Reti o Waitangi. And I would say that people who are mentoring, particularly provisionally certificating teachers, but who are endorsing any renewal for practicing certificate, they need to be prepared to say this teacher doesn't make the grade if that is the case. Mentors and professional leaders are the gatekeepers of our profession, and if we have people who are going, well, she's really good with the children and the parents love her, but actually in a team she's just a nightmare, well, then that person wouldn't be meeting the professional relationship standard, or probably learning focused culture standard either. And they shouldn't be endorsed as meeting those standards if that's the case. You know, we all suffer with the legacy of people who have been endorsed as fully certificated teachers if they're not where we want them to be as a profession.
100%, couldn't agree more. I think, Barbara, you've answered Pavula's question there as well, and any questions people have about the amount of evidence that is required. Barbara, there is a question here from Mary, which, Mary, your question is around observation and what that should look like. I don't think we've got time to answer that tonight, but I can let you know, Mary, that we've got a course coming. We've got 2 courses coming out very, very soon. One is the main course that Barbara mentioned earlier around mentoring, and I can highly recommend that. She does cover observation in there and how to do that effectively. And there's also a shorter course, which is an element of that one that we have pulled out that is specifically on how to observe and give feedback effectively, and that is coming very, very soon, so keep an eye out for that. We will let you know when that's available. It's an online course. You can just jump in and do it online anytime. Very, very good. Barbara, just another question here, probably the last question. For a PTC that has moved several centres in their provisionally registered journey, does each mentor they have had over the 2 years do they all need to have been fully registered, or when the PTC is ready to be signed off, is it okay for that person to look over their folder, assess their ability to meet the standards and endorse them?
Great question. Thank you for raising that one. In order to count as part of the 2 years induction and mentoring program, the mentor does need to be fully certificated, and there needs to be an active program in place, not just a nominal mentor who does nothing. And so it depends on, you know, the accumulation over the number of centres that you've been to, how many months have been an active induction and mentoring program with a fully certificated teacher as your mentor. Needs to be at least 24 months. What I really recommend is, if you are moving centres, or if your centre or if your mentor moves, that you get a statement saying mentored this person from this date to this date. The program involved observation, feedback, regular meetings, whatever your program involved, and the PCT was making satisfactory progress towards meeting the standards. And then all of those things together, after 24 months, as long as your last person, your professional leader or mentor in your last centre, when you've had 24 months of induction and mentoring program, if they know you, so usually they say that you need to, a mentor needs about 3 months to know whether you are meeting, you know, to know you well enough to say whether you're meeting the standards. So at that time, 3 months you've been in your last centre, then your final mentor can endorse you. It's not a matter of even needing to go back over evidence or anything like that. Each mentor has said that you're making satisfactory progress and that you've been involved in an induction and mentoring program. If the final person says that you are meeting the standards, they can endorse you.
Thanks, Barbara. There's just one question here that I can answer quickly. Is there a set amount for paying an external mentor? And the answer to that would be it varies widely. It depends who you work with, and the answer is that no, there is no set amount, because it's a private arrangement that you'll often have with somebody, and they'll determine their own rate for that. So that would be the answer to that question. I think that's the final question. Thanks, Barbara. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for you to revisit if you need to at any point in time, or if you'd like to let others know who also need to learn this stuff. So we'll make that available it'll be on your learner dashboard by tomorrow. You can just log back into eclearningunlimited.com, and also do keep an eye out for the courses that we've mentioned tonight. We have assessment and planning for learning coming next week, mentoring in March, wasn't it, Barbara? And provisional teacher certification short course coming in April. Yeah. Oh, and the Te course for teachers is open next week as well. So have a look for those on our website, and we hope to see you there. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Ka kite.
Ka kite anō whānau.